So again, we're going to be reciting the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. This has those two ideas in it. Again, refuge is a sense of whatever confidence we have in the Buddha's teachings, even if it's very slight. We try to bring that to mind, thinking that we're here with that mind that finds these teachings to be of value and that we then want to incorporate them into our lives. And then the second thought of bodhicitta, where we are bringing to mind this wish to help all sentient beings to the greatest degree. This is something we're touching on today in our teaching, this course on uniting wisdom and compassion. This is an aspiration, a very altruistic motivation to be able to be a benefit to all beings by developing ourselves completely, by becoming a Buddha. So we're going to recite this the first time in English, and then we will do it twice, chanting the Tibetan. Great, thank you, Shila. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyen gipe soknam gi dola penchir sangye dupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe soknam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. Okay, thank you, Sheila. Let's do a short meditation. I always like to start classes with a little bit of time for focusing our minds a bit and then generate our motivation together. So just begin by paying attention to the breath. No doubt all of you have some meditation you do with the breath, but if you need a suggestion, just tune into the sensations that occur around the nostrils. It's that very subtle sensation as we breathe in and out through the nostrils, and just try to keep your awareness there. If you find that the mind wanders from that point, then when you notice that, let go of whatever distracted you and guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection where we'll actually take a look at one of the things I taught on last week in the first class in this series. So anyway, you don't need to know much about that. I'll guide you through that. So again, just a few minutes of silent meditation on the breath to begin with. So we can start now. So, as we discussed last Sunday, this course is focusing on the idea of what we call great compassion. We all have compassion to some degree, and that's a good starting point to recognize the ways that our heart opens to the suffering of others. Maybe to start with today in this meditation, we can examine our own experience with compassion. Where does compassion flow easily for us? Who are the beings that we tend to have no problem kind of being with them in their sorrow and their difficulty? And just acknowledge that is, again, perfectly fine. Our compassion is there. We're just always looking to advance it, to take it to a greater degree. But reflect on the ways in which compassion manifests for you quite easily in your life right now. And feel good about that you do have those seeds of compassion within you. And if we are to develop this mind of great compassion, we have to extend this compassion to all beings. And moreover, we have to understand the ways in which they are dealing with an unsatisfactory situation. So let's reflect on what we identified last Sunday as these three types of suffering, or dukkha, as the Buddha said in the Sanskrit. Dukkha means a level of dissatisfaction, discontentment that sentient beings experience. And the very first one is the one that's so obvious to us, what we call manifest dukkha, or manifest suffering. This is what we normally respond to in terms of compassion, is when we see a being who is going through a difficult time, having pain, anguish, grief, and our hearts open to them. Again, just reflect on how, at this moment, not all beings are experiencing that first level of pain or suffering. But nonetheless, all beings have the potential to have that experience. We're all embodied beings, bodies that get ill, that have pains, minds that have torment and anguish. And just reflect on that and feel your heart open to that reality, that all beings have the potential to experience this manifest form of suffering, or dukkha. To see the situation of sentient beings more clearly, we have to go to at least the second level of dukkha, or suffering, what we call the suffering of change. As we discussed last week, this refers to the fact that even when sentient beings find what brings them pleasure, happiness, those experiences aren't in the nature of true pleasure and can actually lead to pain and suffering. And think about your own experience with things that are delightful, delicious, enjoyable. They satisfied for the moment, but you couldn't sustain that level of happiness or satisfaction. You had the experience, it produced some pleasure, and then it was over. It didn't ultimately satisfy. And if you were to continue to experience it, it would actually become painful. Think about the meals you had this week, perhaps on Thanksgiving Day. Might have brought a lot of pleasure to eat that delicious food. But you couldn't have, continued to eat it and gotten more pleasure out of it, because the pleasure diminishes over time. It's not in the nature of producing true happiness. Instead, it leads to suffering. And this is true for every being. The happiness that we attain is not ultimately satisfying. It doesn't do the trick. So reflect on that reality for yourself and all beings, and open your heart with compassion that beings have to experience that. They can't find a happiness that lasts, that ultimately satisfies, at least within the bounds of this existence that we are all involved in. Then finally, to see the complete picture in regard to what beings have to experience that is unsatisfactory, we have to look at the third level. It's pervasive conditioned suffering or dukkha. And this is the idea that every one of these beings, according to the Buddha's teachings, are conditioned by their karma, their actions, and the delusions, the afflicted states of mind that cause that karma to arise. At the root is the contamination of ignorance that all beings who are unenlightened, who are not free yet, they're all experiencing that, all under the control of their ignorance. Because of that, no matter what they do, no matter where they go within samsara, cyclic existence, it's unsatisfactory. It's pervasive. And this is a situation for every being, again, who is still within samsara, still within what the Buddha called our wandering from life to life, under the control of these factors. So reflect on that reality and generate compassion for all beings who are in that state, continuing to be under the control of these factors and not knowing even a moment of freedom. Then remember that the Buddha said that sentient beings don't have to experience any of that suffering, any of that dukkha. They can be free from that. And generate the wish to help sentient beings find that freedom, to become a cause to protect them from dukkha, from suffering, and to bring them to their greatest potential. And really feel your compassion feed into that, because sentient beings are suffering in these ways. We want to benefit. We want to help them. And then the recognition that to do that completely, we have to develop ourselves. Right now, we're simply not capable. Generate the wish to develop your own mind into the state of a Buddha, a fully enlightened being, empowered with the ability to help all sentient beings to achieve their greatest potential, their own enlightenment, their own Buddhahood. And this is the mind of bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings, motivated by this great compassion, this wish to protect them from all levels of dukkha. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll start the class. So again, in last week's class, I introduced what we're going to be doing in these 4 sessions. Again, we're working with this small homage. It's only like 4 verses at the very beginning of this wonderful text by Chandrakirti. And again, I did some introductory comments in regard to this text and the teachings that preceded it and so on. We're going to be using in particular a commentary by Lama Tsongkhapa. Lama Tsongkhapa is the founder of this tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. He lived in the late 14th, early 15th century. This text itself that we're using was written in 1418. So it's got some reliability. It's been around, for 6 centuries and has stood the test of time. So I'm hoping that we can, again, elucidate some of this through using these texts. Let's go ahead and start with just looking back on this topic that we just meditated on, because this is what I ended with last week. And I just want to see if there's any questions on this. Again, when we were talking about generating compassion, normally we just focus in on that first level of these 3 types of suffering. This is where our compassion gets ignited, if you will, is when we see the grosser forms of suffering that sentient beings have to experience. Nothing wrong with that. That's a perfect place to start. That's where our heart's more naturally open. But if our compassion ended there, then first of all, we wouldn't understand the deeper levels of dukkha or dissatisfaction that the Buddha taught. But moreover, we would tend not to have compassion for beings who are not having that first level of suffering. Right? Our compassion would be very limited. And of course, our compassion is already limited to some degree, but our compassion can be as vast as we make it. So that first level is evident. It's obvious. Sometimes it is called obvious or evident suffering. The second level is where we recognize that even those experiences that we call pleasure or happiness are identified as suffering in this context because it doesn't have the ability to last, and it will turn eventually into pain. If we sustain that pleasurable experience that we think is pleasurable, we actually find it leading down that pathway to pain. Of course, all of our objects of enjoyment, everything that we experience, lacks any inherent nature to bring happiness. It brings a contrasting feeling of happiness, but that feeling of happiness, again, is not in the nature of true happiness. It eventually will lead to suffering. Let me talk about this a little bit. Last week, we used the example of going to the beach, right? So it's a fairly warm day. You go to the beach, you arrive at the beach, you put all your stuff out on the sand, and then you go into the ocean because it feels so good to get into the ocean, all the cool water after having been out in the hot sun all day. But you've just started the suffering of being in the ocean. You will have that suffering manifesting when you've been in the ocean too long and you get goosebumps and you need to go back out into the sun and take the sun rays so that you become warm again. But at the moment you lay in the sun, you've begun the process of the suffering of being in the sun. You just aren't experiencing it that way. It feels like happiness because it's a contrast to what we were experiencing in terms of the suffering of being cold in the water. This is what we do at the beach, right? You go and you lay in the sun, and then you get in the water, then you get out of the water and you lay in the sun, and then you get back in the water and you cool down. And this is fun at the beach, but it's not true fun. It is a feeling of happiness when you go from something that is cold to something that is warm. It is a feeling of happiness when you go from something that is hot or warm into something that is cool. This is the nature of our experiences. Those are happiness feelings, but they aren't in the nature of true happiness. Now, again, it might sound kind of depressing for people who are new to these teachings, like, well, you Buddhists, you're so pessimistic and so, looking at everything in such a negative way. We're just trying to see things for how they actually are. Are those really true experiences of happiness? And have any of them ultimately satisfied you? That's the bigger question, right? Anything you've experienced in your life, and of course, we've had countless lifetimes according to the Buddha, have any of those things gotten to that level of satisfaction where we say, okay, I don't need to do anything else again. I'm fully happy. I'm fully content and will never have to experience anything other than that. That's what the Buddha is promising that we can actually attain, is a state of well-being that is lasting, that is eternal, that is not changing in the way that this suffering of change occurs. Things change. Things don't stay the same. Things will progress to something that is painful, something that is difficult if we continue to engage in those pleasant experiences. They don't have the ability to truly satisfy. This is an important thing to see. This meditating on the second level of dukkha or suffering is a doorway through which we can begin to see the unsatisfactory nature of things. That seeing that begins to cultivate what we call renunciation, a mind that wants to turn away from that, not to just nothing, where we just kind of go, oh, it's just all depressing and horrible, but turn towards liberation, turn towards freedom from all of this. And of course, the freedom is attained when we become free of the causes of being in this state, which are signified by that third level of dukkha. The third level of dukkha we call, again, pervasive conditioned suffering. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would call this pervasive compounding suffering, and I'm going to share a quote from him in a moment. Essentially, this refers, as it says there, to our unenlightened existence, wherein we are under the influence of a process that is not under our own control. We can control it to a degree, but the factors of it continue to be there until we have removed them. Secondly, it involves the fact that we are ruled by our karma, our actions, and our afflictive emotions, these states of mind that are not grounded in reality. And their underlying root cause our basic ignorance of the nature of reality. I mentioned that in the meditation. We're going to talk about that more in the next two classes in particular, where we get into the deeper ways that we can generate compassion, understanding the ways in which sentient beings are involved in this process and how we can, view them in that light. The third point there, this is the most difficult of the three types of suffering or dukkha to realize. We have to get to that place where we see every being we meet who is not, who hasn't attained liberation or enlightenment. All of those beings are under the control of this process. Every politician that we have in our world, every spiritual leader that we have in our world who is unenlightened, every being is under the control of this process. To develop any lasting compassion or wisdom, it says there, that last bullet point, it is especially important to understand this third level of dukkha, suffering. With that understanding, in conjunction with developing loving kindness for all beings, one can proceed to develop great compassion. We really need to see the extent to which sentient beings are suffering just because they're conditioned in this way. They're under the control of these factors. Again, this is the deepest teaching the Buddha gave in terms of really seeing our situation. I mentioned last week that he started his teaching career, his very first discourse he gave on the Four Noble Truths. And in those first two truths, he said, guess what, folks? You're in this experience of dukkha. And this is what's entailed in it. In the second one, he said, then this is what's causing it. What's causing it is, again, things within our own minds, our own ignorance giving rise to various states of mind, our own karma that is created from that, and then us having to experience the results of our karma, going from life to life under the control of this process that, again, we can kind of have some monitoring of that and altering of that if we have an awareness of it, but we can't be free of it until we do the deeper work. And what we're going to talk about again in the remaining two classes is how we do that deeper work and inform our compassion with an understanding of the ability to do that deeper work. But until we see that that is the reality for every single being, we can't really develop the genuine compassion that feeds into bodhicitta that we meditated on in meditation today. Bodhicitta comes from great compassion. Because if we understand that all sentient beings are under the control of this process, and therefore they are experiencing this dukkha in the various forms, if we want to be a benefit to them, we have to get at the root cause. We have to be able to uproot the whole process for ourselves initially, and then help all beings to do the same. So we have to attain Buddhahood on the basis of this knowledge. And our great compassion then gets informed by that whole understanding. We're going to see this come up again next week, so I'm not going to belabor it by talking too much about it. But what I want to do then let me actually see if there's questions before I go forward. I know I might be opening up to use of our time that we have together, but are there any questions on this idea of these three levels of suffering or dukkha? And suffering is the preferred translation, but dukkha means more than that, as we saw, these different dimensions of kind of dissatisfaction. Anyone? If you have a question in the Gompa, just raise your hand and we'll have the microphone. If you have a question in the Zoom room, you can do your little icon down below with your reactions tab and then put your hand up. Or you can put something in the chat box if you don't want to be on camera. So, All right, we will move forward then. So what we're going to do with the remainder of our time, oh, I wanted to share that quote, sorry. I just said that I wanted to share a quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. This is just a couple of slides here that give a feeling for how Rinpoche would talk about this. Once more, just to revisit, this is the objectives for this course. I said I would kind of introduce it at the beginning of each of these slideshows. First, to develop a strong conviction in the importance of compassion as the root to the Buddhist path and to be inspired to put great effort into cultivating it. What we're going to focus on today in today's class is primarily this objective, to really see the importance of compassion, to see that it is at the root of all of the various results the Buddha taught, and that it has an importance in terms of all of our progression through the path. The second one we're going to go into a little more deeply in the next two classes, to learn how to deepen and stabilize compassion by informing it with the wisdom teachings of the Buddha. And then, of course, throughout this, I'm going to be introducing you to Chandrakirti's text if you have not encountered it. And then, of course, Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on it. So this is what Rinpoche says about, again, what he called pervasive compounding suffering. It's kind of an interesting usage of that word. We have compounding interest, right? Which means you get more interest on the interest and so on, as if, this is what we're doing in samsara. We just keep creating more suffering on top of suffering, if you will. Rinpoche says, His Holiness mentions that this collection of body and mind is a product of delusion and karma. The afflictions, delusions, negative emotions, there's a lot of different names for these states of mind. And karma, again, our actions. It is under the control of karma and delusion. This is another meaning of pervasive compounding suffering. Because this mind and body that we have now is under the control of delusion and karma, that's why it is in the nature of suffering. It's like our whole existence is pervaded by that because we're under the control of these factors. You can be free of those factors by attaining liberation and enlightenment. That's why this body is in the nature of suffering, Rinpoche says. That's why this mind is in the nature of suffering. That's why we experience so many problems. Again, we tend to get really focused on the first level of dukkha or suffering when the mind or the body are showing signs of that suffering, when it's actually pain or anguish again. But that's just part of the process. We have to see that the entire thing is encompassed by this concept of being under the control of our karma and delusions. As long as that's the case, we never know a moment's rest from that. I think I may have shared, I don't know if I shared this last week or not, the very first teaching I ever had from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I didn't really get much of his speech, and so I got maybe 5-10% of what he said. But the one thing I really remember that I took away when he said, there are no vacations in samsara. In this state that we are in, under the control of these factors, what's called samsara or cyclic existence, there are no vacations. We like to think when we go on vacation, we leave all our problems behind and we get to enjoy some state of liberation from those problems. Those problems are all still there. Dukkha is all still there. You're still conditioned by your karma and delusion. Sometimes we go on vacation and have a decent time and feel good and refreshed when we come back. But other times you go on vacation and it's not what you thought it was going to be, right? Things go wrong. The travel is crazy. You get stuck somewhere because of, flight problems or whatever. And then you get there and the hotel's not as nice as you thought it was going to be and everything, and so on, right? Because we're just conditioned by karma and delusions to have these varieties of experiences. You're never really getting a real vacation. Not for one moment have you known freedom from these factors. So it is important to understand that. We're going to look at that again a little bit more next week. Next week is when we get into the idea of how we delineate compassion into these three types. This is an important topic, again, that Chandrakirti goes through. Let's go to what I want to do actually to get this started is I want to do a little recitation. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. Let's just recite this together because I think there's some power to just reciting these words that are in the verses that I'm going to teach. Again, it's just 4 verses. And what we're going to do today is not recite all of them because we're mainly going to focus on the first 2 verses that are on the screen there. So if you can see that, hopefully you can see that. I can take it a little bit larger, I think. And what I can do then, I'll just scroll down a little bit there. I think they'll all be on the screen, maybe not. Okay. There, I think they're all on the screen there. Okay. Hearers and middling realizers of suchness are born from the kings of subduers. Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. The mind of compassion, non-dual understanding, and the altruistic mind of enlightenment are the causes of children of conquerors. Mercy alone is seen as the seed of a conqueror's rich harvest, as water for development, and as ripening in the state of long enjoyment. Therefore, at the start, I praise compassion. So as I mentioned last week, this praise is to great compassion. They use just compassion as shorthand for that. But once more, great compassion is where we actually wish to protect beings from suffering and help them in that way. It's not just the compassion that is sad or upset that people and beings are suffering. It's wanting to go beyond that. So what we're going to start with in terms of the class today is look at this first part. Again, those first two verses are said to be within the section of this homage that are where we're just making homage to compassion in general, not with delineating various types of compassion. In the last two verses that we're going to look at, verses 3 and 4, is where we actually get into delineating them in more detail. So, oops, let me go to this. This is the text that is out there, again, on the materials link that you have, course materials link at TNL, the Buddha Center's website. You can have access to all these materials. This is just the pages that pertain to our homage to great compassion that Chandrakirti composed and Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on it. As you see, this expression of worship or this praise to compassion, homage to compassion, has two parts. Number one, praise of great compassion without differentiating its types. And then two, the homage to that compassion within differentiating its types. My goal for today, we'll see if I make it or not, is to go through the first of these two parts. So, praise of great compassion without differentiating it into three types. The Honorable Chandrakirti, having assumed the task of making a supplement, again, to Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, these are figures that I talked about last week, does not state as his object of worship the hearers and solitary realizers who are taken as objects of worship in other books. Furthermore, he indicates that rather than praising Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, which also are praised in some texts, it is suitable to praise great compassion, the most excellent cause of Buddhahood, bearing the nature of thoroughly protecting all vulnerable sentient beings bound in the prison of cyclic existence. It is also the main cause, called by the name of its effect, the Blessed One, Bhagavati. So, in that last part, he's meaning that great compassion is called the Bhagavati, the Blessed One, because it gives rise to its effect, which is Buddhahood. So remember that we had, I'll put back on the screen, last week's handout is here. Let me go back to that. Sorry. I had the three types of suffering there, but remember I had these three vehicles right in the center of the screen here. We have two different paths that the Buddha taught. Again, the Hinayana or the individual vehicle, the Mahayana or the universal vehicle. And within the Hinayana, the individual vehicle, there are two different types of practitioners. We're going to start with looking at those. But those are amazing beings. They have set their minds on achieving their own liberation from samsara. On the other side, the Mahayana, the universal vehicle, has bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are intent upon full awakening, Buddhahood, so they can benefit all sentient beings. They go beyond their individual concern with a universal mind of compassion for all beings. This is where we are focusing. That's why Bodhisattva is highlighted there. This is what we are focusing on in terms of being the main compassion as the root for developing into Buddhahood. But in order to demonstrate that, what Chandrakirti does, and what Lama Tsongkhapa is going to comment on, is he sets out this sort of process, this presentation of a chain of causes that we're going to be looking at in this first verse. So hearers and solitary realizers, again, we're going to talk more about them in a moment. They're these two practitioners that are intent upon achieving their own liberation. And solitary realizers, by the way, are called middling realizers. We'll talk about that in a moment. Where do they come from? not in terms of like, who are they born from in a way that we talk about birth of human beings and what have you, but where do they arise from? They arise from the teachings of Buddhas. So Buddhas, which are in this verse called the kings of subduers, give rise to or cause the birth of those who want to achieve their own liberation by way of giving the teachings that they follow. Where do Buddhas come from is the next question that we have. Well, Buddhas come from bodhisattvas. And in this case, it is actually bodhisattvas who eventually develop their minds into Buddhas, though there are other ways that bodhisattvas also can be said to be contributing to the arising of Buddhas. But very directly, Buddhas don't arise without someone becoming a bodhisattva first. A bodhisattva is a Buddha wannabe. It's somebody who is in training to become a Buddha. And we're going to talk more about what it means to be a bodhisattva in a little bit. Well, then the question comes, well, where do bodhisattvas come from? This is like a child when you're telling a child something, well, where does that come from? And where does that come from? Well, where do the bodhisattvas come from? Well, the three main practices were in that verse at the end: the mind of great compassion, non-dual awareness, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then the altruistic mind of enlightenment, which is also what we know of as bodhicitta. So these are the main causes of a bodhisattva. And as Chandrakirti is going to set out, the main one among those three is the first one, the mind of great compassion. So in essence, what Master Chandrakirti is doing in this initial part of this homage is he's saying, okay, rather than paying homage to these hearers and solitary realizers, these practitioners of the Hinayana path, which again, many texts do, they're amazing beings. I'm not in any way discounting them that they're only set on their own liberation. That's quite a goal, and that's quite an accomplishment to achieve. They're beings who are following a path that the Buddha taught to their own individual liberation. And of course, he's also not going to pay homage to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, even though those are incredibly noble beings that are on the Mahayana path that want to attain enlightenment for the sake of all beings. Instead, he's going to go to the root cause of all of these results and say that everything arises from great compassion. Without great compassion, none of this will come into existence. You won't have bodhisattvas, you won't have Buddhas, you won't have all the hearers and solitary realizers that benefit from the Buddha's teachings. That's what we're looking at in the initial part of today, is to really gain an appreciation for great compassion being the root of these various results. Let me describe for you these two practitioners in particular, though I guess I could go into all four of these so we have good understanding of the terminology. First of all, hearers. Hearers in the Sanskrit are Shravaka. Again, I don't need to go into the Tibetan. Those are just the widely of the Tibetan terms that you might see in Tibetan texts. First of all, they're called sometimes listener hearers, since having listened to the teachings, they then practice them and cause others to hear about what they have achieved. Now, they are listening mainly to the teachings about how to achieve individual liberation. They're not listening to the teachings on bodhisattvas and that path necessarily and practicing them, though they do often hear those teachings. And that leads to a second way that we can also think about the hearers, these Shravakas. They're called hearer proclaimers, meaning that they do actually proclaim the Mahayana to others. Having heard it, they might proclaim it and say, oh, this is a very noble path of the Bodhisattva and so on. But unlike Bodhisattvas, they don't practice it. Now, why don't they practice it? Well, it's an individual disposition. This is why the Buddha taught the variety of paths that he did, is because some beings don't have that inclination to go all the way to enlightenment right from the get-go. The Buddha does say we all will eventually attain Buddhahood, but some beings need to at least first get to a state of liberation, and then they can get to full enlightenment at a later stage. So in terms of what they do on their path, as it says there in that third bullet point, they cultivate what we often call, again, these two collections, merit and wisdom, over 3 lifetimes to achieve what's often referred to as small enlightenment, the lesser enlightenment of a hearer. Again, these collections of merit and wisdom are similar, though not fully qualified collections. We're going to see that coming up shortly. But remember these 2 wings of a bird that we talked about last week. This is what we have in the title of this course, right? Uniting wisdom and compassion. We have kind of the wisdom and merit, the merit that we generate through having compassionate motivation and bodhicitta and so on. This is what we're trying to do on our path, is to get these two collections to completely bring about the final result. If you don't have the complete collections, you can't have the result. This is how cause and effect work in terms of, creating the results that we wish. So essentially, when the bodhisattva path, these are delineated quite clearly. For the hearers and the solitary realizers, they're not quite fully qualified collections, but we can still delineate one side as wisdom and one side as merit. Because those, to achieve their goal, they still need that wisdom, right? This is something we discussed briefly last week. In order for them to attain liberation, you have to eliminate the cause of being in samsara. You have to eliminate ignorance. Therefore, you need the wisdom that will counteract that ignorance and destroy it. But they also need some level of merit. But as you can see from what was on the chart, the level of merit that they produce is really pretty insignificant. 3 lifetimes. 3 lifetimes. It's not so much, right? We've had zillions of lifetimes. If we just practice, for 3 lifetimes with a dedicated mind of renunciation and engage in the trainings of the hearers, we can attain small enlightenment. But not all of us have that inclination. Hopefully, most of us gathered here today have the inclination of the bodhisattvas who want to become a Buddha. Let's go to the second one of these, the solitary realizers. This is the term in Sanskrit, pratyeka Buddha. According to Maitreya's Ornament of Clear Realizations, another text that I studied in the master's program, solitary realizers make 3 prayers. They have that same inclination as a hearer to achieve their own liberation, but they make these 3 distinct prayers. First, to not rely on the teachings of a master in their last rebirth. In other words, they want to kind of achieve independent and solitary realization of Buddhahood, or of their freedom from suffering. Again, they're not achieving Buddhahood. They're often kind of, this term Sangye that's in there is often translated as Buddha, but they're not a fully qualified Buddha. They have simply attained their own liberation. And they want to do that in a solitary manner. And 2, to be born where there are no Buddhas or hearers present. That further affirms their solitary nature. They don't want there to be other practitioners. They don't want there to be a teacher in their last life that they rely upon. They want to achieve it on their own. His Holiness once said this makes them sound awful prideful, but it's not pride. It's a real sense of wanting to accomplish something that is meaningful for them. And thirdly, His Holiness often points out how they do have a compassionate wish to benefit others, just not bodhicitta. The third one, they wish to be able to teach others with only bodily gestures, by performing various gestures to be able to impart Dharma to others. And how wonderful. They have that inclination, at least, to benefit others when they've attained their own liberation. Remember, both the hearers and solitary realizers, when they attain their liberation, they have that freedom then from their karma and delusions, but they have not achieved their greatest potential. And so again, they sort of check out of samsara, and then they are eventually brought back into the final vehicle of Buddhahood to achieve the path of the Mahayana through practicing the bodhisattva deeds and so on. The second bullet point there for solitary realizers, they cultivate merit and wisdom, again, these kind of designated collections over 100 eons to achieve middling enlightenment, much longer period of time. So these are more serious practitioners. These are not, just 3 lifetimes. They want to do this over 100 eons. And they achieve what we are called middling enlightenment. Hence, we call them middling realizers. What are Buddhas? Of course, Buddhas, this is again, that is the Sanskrit term, means the kind of awakened one. In Tibetan, Sangye, which I think I've discussed on a number of occasions, it means to fully purify and to fully develop our minds. They are called in this verse kings of subduers, since they have attained an excelling lordship of the doctrine, superior to all 3, hearers, solitary realizers, and bodhisattvas. Again, because bodhisattvas are Buddhas are in training to become a Buddha. They don't have the complete realization of the Dharma, the doctrine that a Buddha does. And they have gone beyond just subduing the afflictions. They have subdued all of the faults in the mind. They teach dependent arising without error to hearers and solitary realizers. These are the teachings that they give to the hearers and solitary realizers, on the basis of which those beings achieve their results. They are liberated from samsara. The bodhisattvas, of course, are the practitioners who eventually become a Buddha. They are those who have developed the uncontrived mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta. We're going to talk about bodhicitta at the end of today if we manage to get to that. But essentially, this is the mind that, again, wishes to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. Now, for most of us, we have to meditate on that mind quite a bit, and there are techniques for generating it that I'm not going to have time to go through in this course. But compassion is obviously a main component of that. Compassion and loving kindness inform our bodhicitta. And we practice developing it in what's called a contrived way, where we have to bring that to mind through deep meditation on the various points. There are two main techniques for generating it. You have to go through that and develop realizations of each of these individual points and eventually get to a place where you have an uncontrived realization of bodhicitta. That's the designating point at which you become a bodhisattva. It's a pretty major accomplishment in and of itself. But if you don't have that stability to that mind, then obviously you don't have the basis to progress to Buddhahood. It's the main kind of factor that leads us into the bodhisattva path. But again, its root is in great compassion. So we're going to talk about that later in that context. But what we mean by a bodhisattva is a being who has that bodhicitta at that level. Again, uncontrived, which means it will arise spontaneously. They can just see a sentient being and immediately they want to become enlightened for that being. They don't have to think, oh, that being was my mother and that being showed me kindness and I want to repay that kindness and so on, all the various things, again, that are involved in our normal meditation on bodhicitta. In our verse, they are called children of conquerors. But this is not to refute bodhisattvas as causes of Buddhas. Bodhisattvas are causes of perfect Buddhas for two reasons. Although you can say they're the children of the Buddhas, the conquerors, they are the cause for Buddhas, first of all, from the viewpoint of state. I mentioned this earlier. The Buddha that a particular bodhisattva will become is in the same mental continuum as that bodhisattva. In that way, that's the substantial cause, right? You right now, and again, if you develop your mind through developing great compassion, getting uncontrived bodhicitta, you become the cause for your eventual Buddhahood, of course. The bodhisattva becomes a Buddha. It's the substantial cause. Substantial cause simply means the cause that from that, it's the main factor that gives rise to the result. Like the substantial cause of a flower is the seed of the flower that came from another flower that is then planted and gives rise to the flower that it becomes, right? There are a lot of other factors that contribute to a flower being there, right? Sunlight and water and warmth and all the various things that are factors. But without the seed, the main cause, you cannot have the result. It's the substantial cause. A bodhisattva is a substantial cause for a Buddha. Makes sense, right? Don't need to explain it too much. How else, though, do they act as causes for Buddhas? The second point there, through causing to uphold, in that other bodhisattvas exhort novice bodhisattvas to uphold bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, and thus they assist those bodhisattvas in becoming Buddhas. That's kind of a cooperative condition. They say that even earlier on, although Shakyamuni Buddha appeared in this world and seemed to have Maitreya Buddha as his disciple, Maitreya Buddha actually had developed bodhicitta before Shakyamuni Buddha. And when Shakyamuni Buddha was just a novice bodhisattva, Maitreya, as this bodhisattva as well, encouraged him to uphold his bodhicitta and so on. So that's another way that we can say that bodhisattvas give rise to Buddhas and that they act as a condition to help novice bodhisattvas stay on the path, to actually not lose their bodhicitta. I mean, when you become a bodhisattva, you're embarking on a pretty major task. I'm not trying to burst anybody's bubble or diminish your desire to achieve that result. But it's like the biggest undertaking you can have ever is to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. As we see on the chart, let's go back to that. They accumulate the collections of merit and wisdom equaling 3 great countless eons. What's a countless eon, a great countless eon? I think the number that they threw around in the master's program was something like 10 to the 59th years. 10 with 59 zeros behind it, that many years. Now, again, I'm not trying to discourage anyone by putting that out there. Because remember that in this tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, we have the tantric path. Everything I'm teaching throughout this course is sutra, and we need the sutra path as a foundation for going into Tantra. But the sutra path says, yes, you have to accumulate all this merit for 3 great countless eons in order to achieve the great enlightenment of a Buddha. But in the tantric path, you can achieve it much, much quicker. In fact, you can do it in a single lifetime. You can do it in 3 years of a single lifetime with the proper conditions. So again, aspire to also practice the tantric path. And again, there's many of you who are already engaged in tantric practices through tantric initiation and so on. I'm not going to talk much more about that because again, it's beyond the scope of this course. But I do want to point out that again, undertaking this task of becoming a Buddha is a pretty major thing to sign up for. And it's the best thing you possibly can sign up for because once more, it will help you to achieve your potential, but moreover, to be able to help countless other beings achieve theirs. Yeah. That's what this great compassion is about, is opening our hearts to the reality of all beings in the same predicament that we ourselves are, so that we don't shut our heart out to even one of them, so that we have a heart that embraces all of them and wants to protect all of them from suffering. So that gives you a basic idea. I'm not going to go into the remainder of like that verse talking about these 3 causes of a bodhisattva. What I want to do now is go to the text and just go through a few points. So again, in that first 2 lines, hearers and middling realizers of suchness are born from kings of subduers, we have this idea that again, hearers and solitary realizers, those on the individual path to their own liberation, are born or arise from the teachings of the Buddhas, the kings of subduers. Again, I highlighted some passages, but maybe I don't need to go through all of these because I explained some of this in going through the handout. Nonetheless, I'll go through this real quickly. Hearers are so called because they listen to correct precepts from others. And after attaining the fruit of their meditation, the enlightenment of a hearer, again, we often refer to that simply as individual liberation of a hearer, they cause others to hear about that fact. They say, I have done what was to be done. I will not know another birth. I will not be reborn in samsara again, and so forth. Many such instances appear in the scriptures. Then Zalmasung says the Sanskrit word for hear, Shravaka, can also mean hearing and proclaiming in the sense that they hear from the Buddhas about the superior fruit or the path proceeding to Buddhahood, again, the Mahayana, and they proclaim it to those of Mahayana lineage seeking that path. But again, they don't practice it themselves. I'm skipping over huge chunks of this where there's like objections. Sometimes, and again, these texts are used in the monasteries to have debates and to engage in deeper investigation of these teachings. That was the first of the 2, the hearers. Let's go and briefly touch on the second one. Again, I'm not giving you more information than what was on the handout necessarily, but there's a little bit more in this paragraph. In Chandrakirti's root text, middling realizers of suchness is a equivalent to emptiness or selflessness. We're going to talk more about that in the classes to come. That was translated in Tibetan as middling Buddhas. Again, they were called kind of Sangye, meaning Buddhas, realizers. But of course, they're not really Buddhas. In the commentary, Chandrakirti says that Tattva Buddha, the Sanskrit term, applies to all 3 persons. Here, solitary realizer and Buddha superiors, those who again have achieved their results. With regard to the meaning of this, some identify Tattva Buddha as realization of suchness and apply it to all 3. As will be explained, this is a good interpretation because it is said Tattva means suchness and Buddha means realization. When the term Buddha is taken to mean realization of suchness, again, this applies to all 3 persons. So what's being said there in essence is that for any of these 3, for a hearer, a solitary realizer, or a bodhisattva to achieve the result of liberation for themselves, the first 2, or Buddhahood, they have to realize suchness. They have to realize emptiness. They have to get at the root that is causing them to be in samsara and to be in unenlightened existence. And not a big statement, I'm just sharing a little bit of the words of those. These texts do sometimes get a little more technical, but don't worry about it. Again, I'm going to give an explanation as best as I can. So though the term realizers of suchness also indicates solitary realizers, it was translated into Tibetan as Buddha. In general, the term Buddha should be rendered as Buddha, but here this is not appropriate. For it is also explained that Buddha is used to indicate an opening of lotus petals and an awakening from sleep. Therefore, Buddha is not the only translation. So you can translate things in a variety of ways. This is true in the Sanskrit. It's also true in the Tibetan. With respect to the meaning of middling, solitary realizers surpass hearers through their superior feature of practicing merit and wisdom for 100 eons. However, since they do not have the two collections of merit and wisdom, nor the compassion viewing all sentient beings at all times, nor omniscience and so forth, they are inferior to perfect Buddhas and even inferior to bodhisattvas. Thus, they are middling. Okay. So, in his commentary, Chandrakirti says that a solitary realizer's wisdom surpasses in its increase that of a hearer. This increase should be taken to mean proceeding higher and higher on the path. Solitary realizers are intent on cultivating merit and wisdom over 100 eons. Thus, unlike the hearers, they are able to continue cultivating the path for a long time. And then it says here, Chandrakirti says that solitary realizers do not collect merit and wisdom. However, they do have secondary or imputed collections. I might share a couple of passages from a different translation of Tsongkhapa's text, again, the one by Thupten Jinpa, that talk about this. They mentioned this earlier, that they don't really have fully qualified collections. So this is Lama Tsongkhapa commenting. He says, although the term collection may apply to these two, again, merit and wisdom in general, the primary referent of collection here is as stated in the following in the Clear Words commentary by Chandrakirti. They uphold great awakening, Buddhahood, by cultivating the perfect truth, and thus the collection is constituted by great compassion and so forth. In other words, to achieve Buddhahood, you need those great collections. Here, collection applies to those factors that uphold the fruit, unsurpassed awakening, Buddhahood, again, not individual liberation, through methods that accomplish it without distortion. Hence, the term refers to merit and wisdom that embody this meaning. Those not encompassed by this meaning are only ordinary collections. They're only kind of designated as collections. They don't really have that full connotation. Whoops, I'm sorry, didn't mean to do that. This connotation of the term comes from the etymology of sambara, which is the Sanskrit word for collection. So again, not a big point. I'm just giving you that idea because once more, we do have to see that these first two that are being delineated, hearers and solitary realizers, they're arising from the words, the teachings of a Buddha, but they don't generate the full collection of what we call merit and wisdom to achieve the greater results. Again, they're noble beings and they have an incredibly noble result that they achieve of their own liberation. But we as aspiring to the Mahayana want to go beyond that. Want to see that again, we want to generate a compassion that encompasses all beings and moreover is great compassion that wants to free them all from the sufferings that they experience. So last little bit coming up here. Whoops, didn't mean to go up quite so far. Because the solitary realizer's progress in merit and wisdom greatly exceeds that of hearers, they are able to generate the wisdom of a destroyer during their final lifetime in the desire realm without depending on another master's teachings. Remember, that's one of the aspirations they make. They don't want to depend upon a master or guru's teachings. Because they become enlightened, that is to say, attain or in the process of attaining that state of foe destroyer, their individual liberation, for their own sakes alone, they are called self-enlightened and also self-arisen. So just kind of connotations of what they mean by these solitary realizers. Okay, I don't know that I need to share that last paragraph. All right. It again essentially means that the solitary realizers and hearers are born from the Buddha's teaching. So we have that question, well, how do subduer kings give birth to hearers and solitary realizers? When Buddhas come to the world, they teach dependent arising. It's an amazing teaching of the Buddha. Lama Tsongkhapa himself praises dependent arising in a wonderful text that he has, a number of verses where he sets out the unequaled teaching of dependent arising that helps us to realize emptiness or suchness. The Buddhas come to the world, they teach dependent arising without error, both in that context of emptiness, but also in terms of cause and result and how things come about. Those bearing the lineage of hearers and solitary realizers listen to the modes of dependent arising, think about what they have heard, and meditate on the meaning of what they have taught. Have thought. Through these stages, the aims of hearers and solitary realizers are fulfilled in accordance with the effect to which they aspire. And in this way, subduer kings give birth to hearers and solitary realizers. Again, not a big mystery behind those passages. It's essentially saying that you don't get hearers and solitary realizers from nowhere. They arise because they hear the teachings that the Buddha gives on dependent arising. And as I said, dependent arising has kind of a number of connotations, but the one that they are focusing on here in particular is this idea of the 12 links of dependent arising. I know Geshe Sherab has taught on this a number of times. I've taught it a few times here. It's a huge teaching. He did, in fact, while he was here in this last set of months, when he was teaching up in Taos, taught on the Rice Seedling Sutra. Those teachings are available through the kindness of the folks, our brothers and sisters up in Taos, who recorded all of those if you're interested in looking at those. But essentially, we will touch on these briefly next week as well. These are what are known as the 12 links of dependent arising. They are a process by which the Buddha shows that we are caught up in samsara, that we are experiencing that pervasive conditioned suffering. The first root is ignorance. From our ignorance, we create actions. Those get imprinted on our consciousness. They give rise to a birth where we have our body and mind. We have an ability to experience the world around us, to come into contact with it, to have feelings on the basis of that, to have craving and grasping. We have a ripening then of a seed that will propel us into another existence, which brings about birth and aging and death, and the process starts all over again because we create more seeds to experience this process. I'm not going to again go into the huge detail on all of this, but this is one of the big teachings the Buddha gives to those beings who are in this category of hearers and solitary realizers. Of course, he also teaches the Four Noble Truths. He also teaches dependent arising in terms of it meaning emptiness and coming to understand how all phenomena appear in a way that is not in accord with how they actually exist. All these teachings he gives to those who are on that path. Why? So they can achieve their liberation. They can achieve the state of a photos drive. That's how they are born from Buddhas. Let's go to the next topic. Back to the text. And I don't think there's too much more I need to say about Buddhas. The way Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. So once more, mommy, if hearers and solitary realizers are born from subduer kings, from what are subduer kings born? The answer, the perfect Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. Again, so that's the line that we had there, that we have already looked at some of that in the handout that I have. Again, it just goes in through in these paragraphs. I don't need to explain this all again. The same two things that we touched on. How are Buddhas born from bodhisattvas? First of all, the bodhisattva that becomes that Buddha is the substantial cause for that. Secondly, other bodhisattvas help that bodhisattva to uphold their bodhicitta, to make their bodhicitta stronger and stronger so they can practice the path. Of course, bodhisattvas also receive teachings from Buddhas. We're not denying that they also benefit in the same way that the hearers and solitary realizers do. It's just that we're talking about bodhisattvas as playing a special role in giving rise to Buddhas because they become Buddhas. Bodhisattvas don't stay bodhisattvas forever. There is that kind of idea in the Mahayana teaching sometimes where we think, oh, bodhisattvas are just going to hold back and let everybody else get to enlightenment first, and then they will become a Buddha. That's a wonderful, very courageous mind. In fact, it's called shepherd-like bodhicitta, where you want to have, just like a shepherd wants to get all the sheep to safety and then retire. So too, bodhisattvas generally cultivate this mind that wants to get all beings enlightened and then become enlightened themselves. But the reality is you can't enlighten other beings unless you're a Buddha. You have to become enlightened and fully qualified yourself to accomplish that task. So having this courageous mind that wishes to get all beings to enlightenment and then I will become a Buddha is very noble. It's again a wonderful mind to cultivate, but you can't actually accomplish that. It's not possible because as you generate this courageous mind that wants to do that, you reach your enlightenment even more quickly. You become a Buddha even more quickly. So Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas in that way. Bodhisattvas generate this courageous compassion that wants to benefit all beings, and they practice the path and so on in order to accomplish that goal. All right. So let's go back to the text again. I'm going to skip over some of this pertaining to the um, let me see, what is the time? I should probably move on. There's going to be in your slides some reference to these 4 reasons why you praise bodhisattvas. But it kind of makes sense, right? You praise the bodhisattvas because from the bodhisattvas come the Buddhas, and there's lots of other kind of reasons that inform that. But essentially, again, he's setting out this causal process in these first few lines of the first verse to essentially say, this is how everything arises from essentially bodhisattvas giving rise to Buddhas, Buddhas giving rise to hearers and solitary realizers. Well, once more, where do bodhisattvas come from? If hearers and solitary realizers are born from subduer kings, Buddhas, and Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas, what causes bodhisattvas? That's where we go into the last few lines of that first verse. The mind of compassion, the root cause, non-dual understanding, and the altruistic mind of enlightenment are the causes of children of conquerors. So let's go back to the handout, and I'm going to talk about these 3 here, and I probably won't go back to the text then because we are running out of time. I wait more than I can possibly fit into this class today. The 3 main causes of a bodhisattva. The first one, the mind of great compassion. This is once more the compassion that wishes all sentient beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and that aspires to protect them or to remove them from those, right? This is what we are focused on in this text. This is what Chandrakirti is paying homage to. Because as we're going to see, without that mind of great compassion, the other 2 don't become causes as well. The second one is called here non-dual awareness or non-dual understanding. Well, what is that? That's a wisdom consciousness. Again, you have to bring in that wisdom component. These 2 work in tandem, the compassion and merit along with the wisdom. This is a wisdom consciousness, as it says there, that is free from the 2 extremes of things or existence, which we call kind of this view of permanence, and non-things or non-existence, which is a view of annihilation. Big words for kind of a it's a somewhat difficult concept, but the idea is that when we find this perfect view of what we call emptiness or suchness, which again we'll go into particularly in the last class of this series, when you find that, you're free from these 2 extremes. Right now, we're in an extreme where we think everything is real and existing in the way that it appears. The Buddha says that's not how things actually exist. But when we start to learn about emptiness and think that things don't exist in the way they appear, we can fall into this other extreme, this other chasm, which is this chasm of, annihilation, thinking things don't exist at all. Well, the Buddha never said that you don't exist at all. The Buddha did say in some sutras things that sound an awful lot like things don't exist at all, but things don't exist in the way that they appear, and it's almost as if they don't exist, but nonetheless they exist. This is again something that is clearly delineated by all the teachings of those great masters, the Buddha himself, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Lama Tsongkhapa, all the beings that we are looking at in this course. Essentially, they put forth this wisdom of emptiness that skirts the middle way between these 2 extremes, that finds this perfect point where you can say things don't exist in this extreme way of having their own existence, but they do exist in a manner of dependent arising, in a manner of coming to existence on the basis of their causes and conditions. And in other ways that, again, we'll go into more in the final class. So when we're talking about a bodhisattva being caused by this non-dual understanding, what do we mean? We mean that many of them investigate, even before entering the path, whether this wisdom exists. All of us who are studying in this tradition, we've all had teachings on emptiness, perhaps, unless you're brand new to this branch of Buddhism, you may not have encountered the teachings on emptiness yet, but you will. They come pretty frequently. Every one of us has a desire to understand, well, what is the way, the mechanism by which you can achieve the results of individual liberation or enlightenment? And of course, if you come to understand that and have conviction in that, then you might sign up for this bodhisattva path and say, well, okay, I'm going to do all this, engage in creating the merit over 3 countless great eons and whatever. I'm going to do all of these bodhisattva deeds, but it's because I know that there's a way out. I know that there's a way to cut the root of ignorance. I know that there's a way to achieve my complete enlightenment and help others to do the same. Without that conviction, may not sign up for this. Now, again, whether you do that later in your bodhisattva path or whether you do it right at the beginning might have more to do with your own individual faculties, your own individual kind of disposition. But we have to have some investigation into the wisdom side of it. Yes, you need the great compassion, that wing that will help you to get to your destination. But you need to have some conviction that there's a wisdom that will actually allow you to accomplish that. That's what we're doing in any of our study around emptiness and around this kind of teaching of the Buddha. Again, that was in that second wheel turning I mentioned last week, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the perfection of wisdom. The third of the great causes of the bodhisattva is bodhicitta. And of course, when you develop uncontrived or spontaneous bodhicitta, you become a bodhisattva. So we are talking there about the mind that aspires to become a Buddha that we are working on through our meditations on bodhicitta at this stage of our development. All of that feeds into getting to spontaneous or uncontrived bodhicitta. So let's go back to our screen here, and for that last one, it's called there the altruistic mind of enlightenment. It's equivalent to bodhicitta. It's just another way of describing it. The desire, once more, for perfect enlightenment, which is the object of attainment. That's what we want to attain, our own Buddhahood, but for the welfare of all sentient beings, which is the object of intent. You don't do this for yourself. You do this for the sake of all beings. You become a Buddha for the sake of freeing all sentient beings from their suffering. So in the context of the homage to compassion, as it says there on the screen, these three are the main causes for producing a novice bodhisattva, a bodhisattva who has just entered what's called the Mahayana path of accumulation, the very first level of development that the bodhisattva goes through. So what we have talked about today then, again, hearers and solitary realizers, they're the kind of the one result that we can talk about, and they go on to achieve their individual liberation. They come from Buddhas because the Buddhas give them the teachings on dependent arising and the Four Noble Truths through which they achieve their result. Where do the Buddhas come from? They come from bodhisattvas, primarily because bodhisattvas become Buddhas. Where do bodhisattvas come from? These three main causes. Now, to investigate these three causes in terms of why is great compassion the root, is because, again, that is where we start. We begin by focusing on generating this mind of compassion that is pained by the suffering of other beings that we see in the world around us and wants to do something about it. Again, that's what makes it great compassion. On the basis of that, we generate bodhicitta, but we can also, of course, begin to investigate the non-dual understanding. The fact that, again, there is a wisdom that will help me to attain that result. It's not just me having this great compassion, this wish that I benefit all beings and free them from suffering, and no means to do that. The means is there. The means are taught by the Buddha in terms of the wisdom teachings that the Buddha gave. If you unite your great compassion and your wisdom, that informs then your bodhicitta, your altruistic wish to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. You say, I'm motivated by great compassion in order to benefit all beings. And I know that there is a wisdom I can cultivate and I can help others to cultivate that will be the means for them to achieve their full potential. So your bodhicitta becomes incredibly powerful when you go through that process. Again, now some may generate bodhicitta without having investigated emptiness and this non-dual understanding. But they will have to do so eventually because they have to understand emptiness and develop the wisdom wing that will eventually help them to attain that result. Otherwise, again, you can't possibly accomplish the result in Buddhahood. So this is what we've talked about so far. Maybe what I'll do is I'll leave it there. We have another section of the verse coming up. Again, that let me pull my screen up here with this one. That second verse that we touched on in the recitation earlier, mercy alone is seen as the seed and so on. This one we'll talk about next week if we have questions that fill up the remainder of our time. But it's essentially getting at the point that we have compassion playing a key role also at various levels of our practice. At the very beginning, by informing our bodhicitta so that we develop that mind, then in the middle of the path so that we continue to engage in all the practices that will lead to the result, and then even when you become a Buddha, Your great compassion is important because your great compassion manifests in your aiding all sentient beings. The state of Buddhahood is one where we can benefit all beings to the degree that they can be benefited, to the degree that their karma allows us to benefit them. But this is, again, something we'll talk about more next week when we get into that verse. So any questions on this first verse and what we're talking about? Yes, Nan, please. We've got the microphone for you. And it looks like Amanda's got her hand up in the Zoom room, so we'll come to Amanda shortly. Let's see what Nan has. Yes.
Okay, and my voice is really not very good today, but what I'm trying to stay away from is reifying the you that you use.
Okay.
Who is this you? And the you for me, and I guess I also go sideways and go, the only way I can really do that is by really having an understanding of emptiness. And that then it doesn't become a linear process, because it almost sounds like it's like when you say and I hear who's the you and who's the I, that the great compassion, and then at some point this understanding of non-dual awareness. But it seems like I can't even really have that understanding of great compassion. It's almost like they all have to happen together.
Yeah.
That there's no separation, but there's a blending.
And that's kind of the goal, is to get to a place where we see dependent arising, which is the way we frequently are referring to that conventional reality, where compassion is generated, where we have an understanding of the process by which sentient beings are reborn in samsara and so on. All those provisional teachings, if you will, have to be united with a wisdom mind that sees the emptiness of all of that, that sees that things don't have any inherent existence. But these two, dependent arising and emptiness, are actually speaking to the same thing. It's just a matter of what perspective we're looking at. On one side, we're seeing that things have no independent existence, and the other way, we're looking and seeing that the only way they exist is by dependently arising, being dependent upon other factors. So these two will be united over time. Lama Tsongkhapa, in his shorter text, it's called The Three Principal Aspects of the Path, says that we've found the correct view of emptiness when we see those two united together simultaneously, without any contradiction, without any division. That's pretty far out for most of us from right now where we're at. We're going to continually go back and forth between these in some regard. We can still say that there is a you and there is an I and there is a world and there is samsara and there is nirvana and there is Buddhahood. We can say that there are all those things. And that in the end is really the way that they exist, is through our designation of them on a basis. There is something that does occur, and we're going to call that Buddhahood. We're going to call that samsara. We're going to call all these various things what we can agree upon and conventionally label them as. But there is no real inherent or intrinsic existence. What we think of as real right now through our ignorance doesn't exist at all. Reality is extremely subtle, extremely subtle. Where Lama Zopa Rinpoche would say it's almost as if it doesn't exist. But almost as if it still does. So we're never denying, that there's a you or that there's a Buddha or that there's anything. Is if it's a conventional phenomenon that we've all sort of identified and agree upon, well, then those things do exist. But they exist in this very, very subtle way. Again, this can go beyond what we can possibly accomplish in these 4 sessions. But this is the goal. Maybe I'll bring in that verse from Lama Tsongkhapa that I can share with you to give some perspective on how we have to work with this understanding of dependent arising and emptiness, kind of balancing between these two so that we eventually get to the place where we see that they're speaking to the same thing. And in that way, generate a deeper wisdom.
But the you that becomes, see, also it's almost like the words don't help.
But the words are necessary and the concepts are necessary.
They are necessary.
Yeah.
And it's how we communicate.
Yeah.
But it's like the I that becomes a bodhisattva is not the I that exists at this point in time. Even, and then there's that it's not time.
Well, there's always kind of what we call, again, the mere I, the mere designation of this as I, the sense of an I that we have in all of our existences.
But we
I,
also say I who is not, who is not, the I who is, how does Geshe Sharp say it? How does everyone say it? Yeah,
yeah.
that is not existent.
Yeah, these are
That's
all
only-
ways of, yeah, describing the emptiness of that I. Again, but we can still say there's an I that has that emptiness, the emptiness of that the I that does not exist from its own side. These two things have to be posited together. A conventional existence, that is the way that it exists in the end, which is mere designation, the mere I, and then the emptiness of that I, that it has nothing more than that. It is nothing more than merely imputed on a basis. The I that I impute, that I think of this collection of stuff being. And that's good enough. That's the way I has always existed. That's the way everything has always existed. We just don't know it.
And so to end, just so I don't end here, I'll just say I'll keep practicing the paramitas.
Yeah. Well, we all have to just keep practicing. Exactly. I mean, it just takes time. These are hard concepts. I'm not going to be able to, I'm just scratching the surface of this sort of stuff in this course. But this is why texts like, again, Chandrakirti's text, the main purpose is to delineate the view of emptiness that is upheld within the view of dependent arising and to give us the means of realizing that. Okay, Amanda, please, and then we'll see if there are other questions. I know Lorna's got her hand up as well. Yes, please.
I've got a question about solitary reasons or realizers or practica Buddhas. So I'm interested in the difference between them not relying on a teacher, the teachings of a master in their last rebirth, them being born where there's no Buddhas, and to teach just with to
Their
teach
bodily gestures.
with no voice, I guess that means. So the thing I'm curious about is whether a solitary realizer has to choose to be like that, or whether they're a solitary realizer, or they can be a solitary realizer by being in those circumstances through no choice of their own. Like if they happen to be born at a time, those three things, those three circumstances. Does it have to be a choice on their part in order to be a solitary realizer, or can it be just circumstance?
It seems from the teachings that it's a disposition that they have that causes them to choose and make those wishes and those prayers, to actually have that manifest for them. And again, it sounds a little bizarre, like, well, where would that come from? But I guess, again, they have some sense of like really wanting to accomplish things on their own through the strength of their own practice and what have you. Yeah, what were you going to say, Mark, to this? Wait.
For the instant, if a person glimpses emptiness for an instant, they're clear that all this wisdom and all this knowledge arises not from a person. It just arises. Okay. Or you might say it arises from Shakyamuni, but it just comes, it arises. And if you see that things just arise, having a teacher, which is fine to learn from someone, but having a sort of guru is a corruption of that purity. They want to avoid that. They want to avoid, if you see the diamond in front of your face, you reach for the diamond. You don't go reach for the teacher. It's just a simplicity.
But I think what you're speaking to, maybe, again, I'm not going to infer things from just what you shared, but again, when you get to that level of cultivating that wisdom, you do see that it does arise from within oneself. But I think solitary realizers, because otherwise everyone who realized emptiness would become a solitary realizer, and that's not the case. So I think we're talking about a different condition that these
Well, I
practitioners-
don't know about everyone. I just know about myself. Okay. I love learning from people, but I do not want a teacher because the solution is sitting on the table in front of me. Okay, that's all it is. It's right there. It's right in front of me. So I reach for that. I don't ask someone how to get to the table because I'm at the table. It's just right in front of me. Okay, in the business about trying to teach by moving your body. Okay, that's a mistake. A better interpretation of that is if you have all this wisdom, okay, you don't need to teach. Just by walking by someone, they can see by the movements of your body, they can learn from it. They absorb the wisdom just from sitting next to you, just from watching you walk by. And so I don't know. That's how.
Again, yeah, in the text they say things like these beings might manifest showing fire from the waist up and water from the waist down. These are bodily gestures or bodily emanations that they do. But again, I don't want to get too into the grasp of all
Okay,
of
but
it,
I'm saying
but
if you are possessed of wisdom and you walk across the room just by the movement, the way you move is a sharing of that wisdom.
sure. I mean, to some degree. And again, it would depend upon whether beings have the inclination to be in tune with that wisdom and receive it. But again, when we go back to the question of these solitary realizers, they as a specific category of Buddhist disciples, if you will, are making these specific prayers. And the others are not. I mean, the others are wanting to have the other conditions that they need to practice their path to their completion. The solitary realizers do have, an answer to Amanda's question, a very specific disposition that causes them to want to be that way. Let me see what Lorna's question is so we have time to address the questions that are here. Lorna, please. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So I've always been curious about the term suchness. And I heard you say this morning that suchness is emptiness. So I'm just wondering, I've also heard the term about the three suchnesses. So what does that mean?
The
three suchnesses.
I don't know.
I've heard in the 21 homages to Tara, there's a mention of the three suchnesses.
You know, I'd have to see the specific reference and kind of look at where it's coming from because you could talk about countless suchnesses or emptinesses in a sense because everything has its own emptiness. The emptiness of the computer, the emptiness of a flower, the emptiness of a person, but yet they are all the same phenomenon in terms of a lack of inherent existence. So they all have the same taste, but there are countless emptinesses in that regard. Now, there are different ways that selflessness or suchness is taught, and that may be a reference to that. Because as I mentioned last week, the Buddha taught for 45 years. He gave a variety of explanations of what is the key to getting free from samsara that were, some of them, not complete because he was teaching to people who weren't ready for the most profound truth. This is what the Buddha was able to discern through his omniscient mind and say, no. If I teach emptiness at the level that you really have to realize it, they're not going to get it and they might find confusion in it and they might end up getting lost. I'm going to teach them in a much coarser way. So there can be a variety of suchnesses or emptinesses that are taught, and we have to really investigate them all and discern which is the most important, which is the one that actually will get us to the result that we want to achieve. Now, we've got these great masters that I mentioned previously and last week as well who have done that work for us. After the Buddha's teachings, you had folks like Nagarjuna who discerned the middle way, this way of getting to the final view of emptiness that the Buddha was teaching in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And you have Chandrakirti, the text we're studying with these verses that delineate that even further. And you have Lama Tsongkhapa who writes these commentaries that help us to get to the exact meaning of it. We can rely upon those, but we do have to find the truth for ourselves. So I'd have to see the specific reference as to why there are the three. I'll take a look at the praises to Tara text and see if I can find there why it's being taught as three. When we use the word suchness, though, by the way, there's another term, thusness. meaning kind of it is thus, that is the way it is, or it is such, that's its suchness. That is what we actually are referring to when we are talking about emptiness. They do start sounding again like, elusive ways of talking about it. But we'll talk about that more when we get to the final class. We're really delineating this idea that we are grasping at, holding to a way of existence that is contrary to how things actually exist. And the way I like to often refer to that as an independent existence, things standing on their own, existing from their own side. They have their own kind of contained existence. But how they actually are is free of that. They don't have that at all. Why? Because they arise dependently, because they have things they depend upon. They don't exist in isolation as their own autonomous units. They exist in a field of interdependence that everything exists in. Even emptiness exists as a dependent arising. Everything is dependent upon other factors. And we'll get into this in more detail, but that's his idea of suchness, that things have that suchness, have that way, that mode of existing, which is free of any independent existing. And we'll get into a lot of terminology in this 4 sessions that might be a little confusing for some of you. Don't worry about, getting it all at this moment. We have plenty of time, this lifetime, hopefully more lifetimes where we can, continue to digest all of these teachings and know that this has to come over time, where we actually integrate the teachings into our understanding. Remember, we had those 3 causes that we just referred to at the end of the lecture today. Not just the great compassion that wants to benefit all beings, but the non-dual understanding that informs that. And then we can feed that into our bodhicitta and make that very powerful. So hang in there with this. Again, I will provide the slides that even some of them that I didn't go through if you're curious to go through this in more detail. But if not, that's perfectly fine. Just feel free to come to the classes, engage in the teachings as best as you can, and don't worry about all the ins and outs and the little details of commentaries and what have you. I think that's all for today then. If there are other questions that you have still, please write them down. You can send them into the center and they'll get to me, or you can save them for next week and hopefully there'll be an opportunity to have them addressed then. Let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers. Shayla, if you could put those on the screen. It's glad to see that Lou is back with us. Thank you, Lou, for joining today. And I'm glad that you're home and feeling better and out of the hospital and everything. Let's keep in mind all beings that we are praying for in particular, that we're holding in our hearts, as well as the beings that are in parts of the world where there's great suffering and strife, and all sentient beings as much as possible as we recite these verses together. May all beings everywhere plagued by sufferings of body and mind obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of our merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And as we recite the prayer for His Holiness, I think that we're creating the causes for all of our precious teachers to have good health, long lives, and to have all their holy wishes fulfilled immediately. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. all-powerful Chandrakirti Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And we make strong prayers for Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation to be identified and all the conditions be there for that being to be of incredible benefit to us and all beings in this world. Okay, thank you all for joining today. Again, don't get lost in the verbiage and things like that. Try to spend the next week, if you can, just trying to cultivate compassion within this understanding of how precious it is as kind of the root cause of everything the Buddha taught, essentially. All the results that can be attained arise from having this great compassion that causes bodhicitta to arise, Buddhas to be there, Buddhas to then teach beings how to achieve their results. It's all coming from great compassion. Again, just try to see the world and the beings in it through that lens. All right, be well. See you next Sunday. Okay, bye-bye.